Thank you, Chris. Good morning, church. Just pull up my slides. There we go. Right. Good morning, everyone. So next Wednesday, I'm sure we all know, is Ash Wednesday, which marks the beginning of the period of Lent. And I believe that there's a 7 p.m. service physically at church. So I encourage us all after work to come to that. Now, in our church calendar, this Sunday is called the Sunday next before Lent. And this morning's gospel reading is from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. And these 9 verses deal with the Transfiguration of Christ. Coincidentally, last year on the Sunday next before Lent, which was on the 11th of February, the gospel reading at church was Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 9, which is the same account of the Transfiguration of Christ in the Gospel of Mark. And any guesses what the gospel reading was 2 years ago on Sunday next before Lent? Well, that was Sunday the 19th of February 2023. Us lay readers and preachers keep our lectionaries, so we know what was being read every year. Well, that was, the 19th of February 2023, and the gospel reading then was Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. The subject matter, the Transfiguration of Christ. So every Sunday before Ash Wednesday, the gospel reading is about the Transfiguration of Christ. In fact, in many churches around the world, including Anglican churches, this Sunday is considered a feast day, and it's called the Feast of the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration of Christ, where Christ shines with divine light, is considered to be one of the 5 major milestones in the gospel narrative of Jesus' life. These 5 are our Lord's baptism, his transfiguration, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ascension. So this morning we will look at why the Transfiguration is so important and how it is related to the Lenten and Easter season. Whether we're looking at Luke, like our this morning's reading, or Matthew or in Mark, the account of the Transfiguration is very similar across all 3 of these synoptic Gospels. Immediately preceding the account of Jesus going up the mountain with Peter, James, and John, all 3 Gospels have the same 2 things that happen a matter of days before this journey. The first is the account of Peter declaring Christ the Messiah. "Who do you say I am?" Jesus asked. And Peter answered, "God's Messiah." The next thing that happens is Jesus predicts his death in Jerusalem. In all 3 Gospels, the account of the Transfiguration takes place a few days after this. Whether the account of the Transfiguration is told in 9 verses like in Matthew or Luke, or in 8 verses like in Mark, the account is fundamentally the same. In Luke, each of the 9 verses tell a distinct part of the story. Verse 28 starts the account off, telling us that Jesus took Peter, James, and John up the mountain to pray. Verse 29 tells us that as Jesus was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became bright as lightning. In verse 30, Moses and Elijah, also in glorious splendor, appeared talking to Jesus. In verse 31, the 2 prophets and Jesus were in conversation about his departure, or Exodus, to take place in Jerusalem. Remember that we, as modern-day Christians, 2,000 years after the events of the Gospels, know that this is referring to Jesus' death on Calvary. It continues. In verse 32, Peter, James, and John wake up from their slumber and notice Jesus' glory and the 2 men he was conversing with. In verse 33, as the 2 prophets were leaving, Peter offered to build 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Well, who can blame him? Here, on this unnamed mountaintop, he was in the company of Jesus, the Lord he proclaimed to be God's Messiah, with his appearance changed and his clothes bright like a flash of lightning. Moses, who was the author of the Old Testament law, and who had died centuries previously, and Elijah, the great prophet of the Old Testament, who ascended into heaven in a whirlwind on a chariot of fire, also hundreds of years before. Here on this mountaintop, you can understand how Peter, the most humanly relatable disciple, wanted to preserve the scene as long as possible. But immediately as Peter made this offer, a cloud appeared and covered all of them in verse 34. Now, can you imagine verse 35, being enveloped inside a cloud that was not there just a minute ago, and hearing God's own voice declaring, "This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." And at the end of this account, upon hearing these words, the cloud immediately cleared, and Jesus was alone with his 3 disciples, Moses and Elijah having disappeared. 9 short verses, but what an amazing account that is held within them. Now, if we briefly look at those key milestones in Jesus' life, God the Father declaring Jesus to be his Son appear in both the first and the second, on the occasion of Jesus' baptism and his transfiguration. Verse 31 from today's reading relates to Jesus' departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. And it speaks to the latter 3 milestones: his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ascension. The event and significance of Christ's transfiguration is therefore a key part of his life and ministry. But it is quite understandable for us to ask the question of why is it so important? Why is the transfiguration considered such a key milestone in Jesus' journey? Why is it given such a significance in church that in our calendar some churches celebrate it as a feast day? How does it, how should it affect our own experience and journey? And how may it impact our experience of the Lenten and Easter seasons? The transfiguration of Christ is significant because it points to how his ministry on earth will end. And sometimes it is important to know how a story ends. This may sound counterintuitive. For example, when we embark on reading a new book or we go to watch a movie, it is a common expression for us to ask our friends not to spoil it for us by letting us know the ending. But in the case of the story about Jesus, upon which the foundation of our faith is built, perhaps knowing the conclusion gives us encouragement to continue our journey. The lady in this picture is an American long-distance swimmer called Florence Chadwick. And I think this picture was taken around the mid-1900s. In 1952, at the age of 34, she set out to be the first woman to swim from Catalina Island off the west coast of America to the Californian coastline, some 26 miles away. She has some form in this. She's actually the first woman to have swam across the English Channel both ways. As she set off on the swim, she was flanked by a small number of boats acting as a support team, watching out for sharks and other predators and ensuring that she was safe, ready to pull her out of the water if she got hurt or got too tired to continue. Now, after about 15 hours of hard swimming in the Pacific Ocean, a heavy fog set in, surrounding her and her support boats. Unable to see where she was going, tired after 15 hours of swimming, she became discouraged and began to doubt her own ability to complete the mission. She asked to be taken out of the water. Her mother, in a boat alongside her, tried to encourage her, telling her that she must be close to her destination and that she could make it. But Florence was physically and emotionally exhausted. She stopped swimming and was pulled out. It wasn't until she was on the boat that she soon realized that the shore was less than a mile away. At the news conference the next day, Florence said, all I could see was the fog. I think if I could have seen the shore, I would have made it. It is remarkable how much we can endure if only we knew how it would end, if we knew how much longer we had to endure for. In Florence's case, seeing the shore could have made the difference between swimming on and giving up. At least that is what she felt. I think we all understand this sentiment. When I go jungle trekking up in the Cameron Highlands, there is a big difference between hiking a trail that I've been on, no matter how challenging it is, and going blind onto a new trail, even though it may be less strenuous. The older trail contains less unknowns, and therefore it's psychologically easier to take on. And I'm sure the sentiment is shared by Edward, Janet, and Chris in their hash runs. The more information on the route, the distance, the terrain, and so on makes it easier to join that run rather than going on it blind. Now, perhaps a useful way to look at the miracle of Jesus' transfiguration is to see it as God's way of showing Jesus and his 3 disciples a glimpse of the shore. It is God's way of encouraging them before they go down the mountain again to the everyday grind of their life and ministry, revealing or reminding them of how it will end by showing them the shore. This miracle can also encourage each of us sitting here today. It shows us the shore. It reminds us of when we will all also be transfigured into heavenly glory. Right before we begin our season of Lent next Wednesday, we are offered a glimpse of Easter. It gives us courage to face our sins and to face the cross, just as it did for Jesus and his disciples, Peter, James, and John. That is why our lectionary always has this gospel story the last Sunday before Lent. The miracle of the Transfiguration comes at an important point of the gospel story. Just 8 days before taking Peter, James, and John up the mountain, Jesus had told his his disciples for the first time what was about to happen when he foretold of his own death. He told his disciples that it was time for him to go to Jerusalem, to suffer and to be rejected by the chief priests, and to die and then be raised from the dead on the third day. Let us remember now that whilst this message of Jesus' death is not a surprise to us, it was utterly bewildering to his audience, his disciples. This is not what they thought they had signed up for, to follow a teacher who would be rejected by Jerusalem, who would be put to death. A reminder then that Jesus' death was not anticipated or expected by those living the gospel story with him at the time. We know the ending, we've read the story, and are familiar with the gospel message. But at this point, the disciples were living it, and the ending had yet to arrive, much less be written. And so, 8 days after this puzzling conversation where Jesus foretold of his death, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and went up on the mountain to pray. And whilst there, this incredible miracle takes place for Jesus and for his disciples. Whilst Jesus was praying, his appearance changed. He was transfigured, at least for a little while, into his post-Easter appearance. He was changed, for a moment, from the Son of Man to the Son of God. For a moment at least, they all saw through the fog, through the uncertainty that surrounded them, through the cross, through the crucifixion, through the trials that awaited them, to catch a glimpse of the shore, to see clearly for one moment the heavenly glory that was coming. Perhaps a curious part of the account of the Transfiguration found in these Gospels is the presence of Moses and Elijah. This is arguably the most spectacular of all miracles recorded in the Gospels up to this point in the story. Moses and Elijah, great prophets of the Old Testament, had both been gone for centuries, although the way they left the world was rather mysterious. Moses died after speaking with God on top of a mountain, but no one knows where he was actually buried. Elijah was carried off on a chariot of fire in a whirlwind, straight up to heaven. And yet here, suddenly and miraculously, Moses and Elijah appear and are talking to Jesus. Might their appearance here be yet another glimpse of that distant shore? Life after death is real. They are proof of it. They have come from that distant shore to show Jesus and his closest disciples that heaven is for real, that life after death is for real. They have come to offer them, and indeed to offer us, a glimpse of that shore. I think if I could have seen the shore, I would have made it, Florence Chadwick had said. The Transfiguration offers Jesus and his disciples, and us, something similar, a glimpse of that shore that they can envision as they head down the mountain back to the struggle that awaits them. And it will certainly be a struggle for Jesus and his disciples. They must come down from the mountain, and Jesus must go to Jerusalem. He must suffer. He must die. The struggle must have been great, and we'll remember Jesus as we prayed in the garden later in Jerusalem. Peter in particular loved being on that mountain. It is good for us to be here, he said. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, of course, we can't blame Peter for wanting to stay on that mountain. We all like to draw out those mountaintop experiences. It was good for them to be there, and Peter wanted to stay. But they could not stay there. Now, popular tradition holds that the miracle of the Transfiguration happened on Mount Tabor. And this picture here is actually the church or monastery that was built on Mount Tabor, and it's called the Church of Transfiguration, to commemorate the miracle that happened there. Some argue that it might be in another mountain because it's not ever explicitly named to be Mount Tabor, but it's where tradition holds it to be. But there was another mountain that awaited Jesus, Calvary. And if heaven is to be real for us, if that shore is to be reached by us, then Jesus must head to that mountain too. But Calvary could not be any more different to Tabor. Let us consider for a moment what mountain Jesus left behind and the mountain he was headed towards. On Tabor, Jesus was transfigured temporarily into glory. On Calvary, he was shamefully crucified, executed for crimes that he was not guilty of. On Tabor, his clothes were shining white like lightning. On Calvary, his clothes were stripped off and gambled away. On Tabor, he was flanked by Moses and Elijah. On Calvary, he was flanked by 2 common criminals who would be executed for crimes that they were actually guilty of. On Tabor, the entire area was covered by a bright cloud. On Calvary, darkness came upon the land. On Tabor, Peter speaks up. and offers to build shelters for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. On Calvary, Peter hides in shame, going as far as denying that he knows Jesus. On Tabor, a voice from God himself declares that Jesus was his son. On Calvary, the noise came from the crowds who ridiculed and insulted him. The two locations cannot be any more different, but they are connected, and they are both needed to tell the whole story of Jesus. Only together do these two famous places teach us of who Jesus is and what he means for us. We cannot understand the glory of the Transfiguration without the shame of the crucifixion. We cannot understand the shame of the crucifixion without the momentary glory of the Transfiguration and the eternal glory of the resurrection. When we look at Christ in glory, we must also see the cross. But when we look at the cross, we must always see the glory that awaits. Sorry. Now, the season of Lent begins this Wednesday, when we focus on the cross. Here at All Souls, like I mentioned, there will be a service on Ash Wednesday at 7 p.m., and we will have ashes placed on our foreheads in the sign of a cross. This is how we begin the season of Lent, when we struggle with the sin that is still in our lives. It won't be easy, not if we take it seriously. It is and should be a struggle, but it is a struggle that has a destination, a glorious heavenly destination. That shore may seem distant at times, but stories like today's gospel reading offer us a glimpse of that shore. They remind us that our struggle is not in vain, that there is not only a shore to be reached, but one that has reached for us, one that has been reached for us by Christ himself. We know that Jesus went down the mountain of his transfiguration and journeyed to Jerusalem. He stretched his arms out on the cross, and he did not give up the struggle, even though it cost him his life. We know what Jesus accomplished, that he accomplished what he had set out to do. When he uttered those words, "It is finished," he had done what he had set out to do, what we, all of creation, needed him to do. We know that the Father raised his Son from the dead after 3 days and transfigured Jesus again, this time once and for all into eternal heavenly glory. In conclusion, we know that Jesus reached that shore and he is calling us to follow him. And so I pray, may we all, children of God, be encouraged by Jesus' journey, rise up and follow him to the cross, to the tomb, and to eternal glory. Amen.